Hi everyone, this is Simon for a rendering teardown section, so welcome. Today we're going to be dealing with this interesting mention rendering. So we're going to be dealing with quite a bit of composition and a little bit regarding lighting and artificial lighting basically, or some sort of consistency in the lighting gestion. So let's get started. First thing I guess, is the composition. There's one main issue in this image. It's the fact that it's sort of an in-between ideas. Basically, there's two ways to see it. The first one you can do for such a render is to either, if you're dealing with the horizontal frame, the idea is to have a more general context and set the building a little bit more on the ground. So what it's lacking here is to actually have more of the sidewalk and where the building is actually sitting, because as you can see here in terms of composition, the building is taking almost most of the available space, which is not really a good thing in terms of ratio, because like when you have this sort of thing here, when the top of your building is extremely close from the top of your frame, it's sort of mostly, like most of the time, it means you're lacking some sort of breathing space. The other thing here I think is an issue is that when you don't have, like, you can, like, usually people tend to have their vertical. So this would mean that instead of having this going like that, we would have this wall going upward in a straight line vertically. But sometimes it can be interesting to keep this sort of convergence, because you want to emphasize the idea that the building is high. We usually do that for towers and really high building instead of a simple house, but it could still be interesting. The thing is, if you want to do it, you have to have a framing that sort of emphasize the idea of height as well. And the best way to emphasize the height is to actually have a vertical framing. So basically, if we wanted to keep this sort of idea, what we should do, in my opinion, is to actually give a little bit more space at the top of the building and anchor it a little bit more in the foreground, and have like a sidewalk and something that basically shows how like gives a sense of scale, because here we don't really have any context and we don't even know what's the actual, like, we know the actual size of the building, but it's not really, there's not really like something to compare it with. Whereas if we had like a sidewalk, someone walking and sort of looking upward and having this really high framing, maybe even a little bit more vertical, this would make more sense in terms of communication. The thing is still, and I think it's hard to disagree here, is that this is not a tower, and the idea is not really to show that it's something that is like a high building or something really slender and going to the sky and things like that. So that's some like there's a mismatch between the actual building or what we're selling and the way we frame it and what we're actually showing. So I would go with something more like something simpler, more space, definitely more space, because we're lacking here. You always have, like, at least for this sort of building, have to anchor them on the ground, because otherwise we don't really understand what's going on, and have the verticals vertical and something like more rational and conventional. Beside that, like with this simple adjustment, it becomes a little bit more interesting, I think. And even in terms of composition here, we do have like a little bit of context, but we need to give it more space and a bigger weight in the image. Well, obviously I cannot really Photoshop anything from this, like, because it's too much of a change, but well, we can try something even though we don't want to use this anyway. Let's do something like that, And the idea, as I said, is to, let's say, something like this. Would be sort of interesting, and maybe if we wanted to do something like that. Anyway, you get the idea. So the idea, basically, as I said, is to give a little bit more of a foreground in the image, so that we sort of anchor the building a little bit more. Obviously, I cannot really do anything properly here, but the main idea behind that is to give something like a foreground, and maybe a bit of scale by maybe using like inserting someone somewhere, so that we get a bit of storytelling and someone passing by. So you get the idea. So that would be it for that in terms of composition. Still, things that I like to consider as well. I'm going to go back to the original framing, because it's not really workable with the rest and the things I've done. The other thing I want to talk about now is the lighting, basically. There's this problem, I think, and that is oftentimes happen in the architectural visualization for this kind of building, actually, is that we do have, like, we're in broad daylight, which is nice, and we use all our artificial lighting. And well, there's two, like, first thing is just regarding the natural lighting, sorry. The thing I tend to tell people to avoid when you're doing natural lighting is to get, when you're doing this sort of shot, with your two facades here and here, is to get them both in the light, because it's always going to be more interesting to have one in the sun and one in the shadow, because you're going to get two different types of hue. You're going to get a better understanding of the geometry of the building and things like that. Whereas if you have the light coming this way, you do lose sort of the geometry of the building, and especially here, because the sky seems to, the sun seems to be extremely low, so that the cast shadows here are extremely high and sharp, actually. So there's I don't think it's really balanced here. It would be more interesting to actually, that's what I did here, and actually it's not complete, is to have this guy here in the shadow, because this way, whoops, sorry about that, because, so this would be cast shadows, that guy, same here. So we'd have something like this, and there would be also, if we use saturation, yes, this would turn a little desaturated and bluish, say something like that, but less saturated. And anyway, you get the idea. Still, so basically what we want is to get a better reading of the geometry. The second thing also is that even though we're dealing with so like first we have a natural lighting that's a little bit more interesting in terms of volumetry, legibility. The second thing is that whether we use this new scenario or the previous ones, there's a mismatch between the sky and the actual shadows, because as you can see, the sky is like it's it's the sky you would have in the middle of the day. Whereas this sort of really, like the sun is really low, so that means that you're not really in at this time of the day. So you would have to use a different sky. Choose these ones, sorry. But it's just like so that you get the idea that you need something that is a little bit more at the end of the day. You don't need to, well, basically you get the idea. You can use whatever sky you want, but it has to fit the hour that you're actually casting your shadows with. Second thing is regarding the overall hue. Well, I just did this sort of a photo filter thing here, but basically you cannot have sort of bluish overall like global illumination, whereas you're at this time of the day, so you need something a little bit more orangish or something like that. The other thing as well regarding the shadows is that we get some really weird and sharp shadows here. Some of them comes from the layers I did, but the original image has had this problem, is that you get really sharp shadows. You can't really know where they come from, even though you think it's might be like the neighborhood neighboring house or something like that, but still it creates really, like, you don't really understand where they come from. So that makes the geometry even harder to understand, and that's not what you want. The other thing is regarding the sky again, is that there's a really interesting way of detailing the inside of your image, of your building, sorry. Here we have paintings, we see there are like lights happening with IES and things like, it's sort of detailed properly. So it would be interesting to indeed have a, like, think we're further in the day, have a more orangish image, darken this part of the image so that you can better emphasize the details you've put in your inside. Here we do have a little bit of a problem. Here. So yeah, I guess the idea here is to get, like, to actually emphasize the inside of the building, make this facade here a little bit darker, and change a little bit its hue as well. And that would be sort of it. So in terms of techniques, there's like, it's quite there, so it's not a problem, but it's just more in terms of composition and storytelling, I'd say that something's missing. Also, there's well, this is, I did that. It's definitely not good looking, but it's just so that you basically understand that you have to choose basically between artificial and natural lighting. Like, you cannot use a full global illumination in the middle of the day and use all your artificial lighting, because it doesn't really make sense. You can still, like, you could keep, if you wanted, of course, your what's happening, like your artificial lighting inside the house, but you would have to play with the reflectivity and its intensity so that you don't make it look like, so that you just use it to make the interior of the building more legible. But really be careful not to use outdoor artificial lighting when you're in broad daylight, because it doesn't really make sense. No one is gonna switch on all its spotlights if it's 3 in the afternoon and everything's sunny. So that's the main idea behind all this. But beside that, there's a lot of potential there. So it's so yeah. Hopefully you've learned interesting ideas on how to deal with your dusky renderings, and especially I think the main problem here was with the composition. So always keep in mind that you have to give a bit of context in your image, and that you have to give a bit of grounding for your image, because, or well, especially when you're dealing with like simple housing projects in the middle of a suburb, because you're not dealing with a tower. So be careful to have like that the framing you're using and the composition you're using is selling the right way the project you're selling, that you're not using like counterintuitive ways of framing your building. Hopefully this all makes sense, and yeah, I'll see you in the next teardown. Thank you guys. Bye.
New